Ibu Patel was 21 years old when he attended his first interfaith conference. And when he went, he noticed that he was, by about 20 years, the youngest person. And he went to one after another and discovered time and time again he was so much younger than other people attending these interfaith conferences. Why would he have gone to one at the age of 21? Well, he thought about all the people who were heroes to him. Dorothy Day, the Dalai Lama, Mahatma Gandhi, Malcolm X, Aga Khan, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Luther King Jr., and thought about how each one of them was deeply grounded in their own faith, even though they were very different faiths. So he was intrigued by the power of faith to cause people to work to make the world a better place. But he was concerned that there were so few young people who were involved in that endeavor, and so he decided that he would start the Interfaith Youth Corps, an organization that brought young people together in order to work on faith matters. And he did that from the depth of his own faith, from a place of his own prophetic imagination, so that he could attend to the core of his faith and enable others to attend to the core of theirs and learn how to speak truth to power. Now, we've been walking for several weeks on the road to Emmaus. And if you remember that story, it's about two people walking on the road to Emmaus after Jesus has died. And they're sad and they're talking about the events. And a third person joins them. And that third person opens Scripture and helps them to interpret Scripture. And then they notice their hearts are burning and they receive a sacrament. So we've been wondering what it was that Jesus would have opened, what Scripture Jesus would have opened with them. And how it is that helped them to recognize Jesus and then to be disciples going forward. So we've talked about the burning heart. We've talked about the story of Moses as a liberator. We've talked about the Torah law and its core message of love. Today I want to spend just a minute talking about the prophets, which Jesus also would have opened to the two on the road. As a matter of fact, of all the scripture from the old scrolls that Jesus uses in his own ministry, the book of Isaiah is the one that Jesus most often quotes. The key things that we want to keep in mind as we think about Jesus and prophetic ministry are these things. First, that prophets arose in Israel at the very same time that Israel decided to have a centralized power, a king. Now, before then, power had been decentralized, and so there was always some manner of discussion between various tribes around how to follow appropriately God's call. But once there was one central king and all power was vested in that king, there came the danger of abuse of power. And at that very moment, prophets arose in order to call that authority into accountability, to speak for the poor and the alien, the despised, the outcast, the widowed. So that's the first thing to pay attention to, that prophets come to speak truth to power. Second, they speak to the world of God's longing for the world. They try to suss out God's desires, judgments, and activities in the world. Prophets are always trying to pay attention to how it is that God is moving in this complex world. And they do so, third, with imagination. For example, in today's passage from Isaiah, the prophet imagines that the people Israel together, named as a single person, but it's imagining Israel together, is in fact a suffering servant. That suffering is actually a part of the way in which God's presence is noticed as Israel is moving through its experience and through history. And that's really a shocking message, and still somewhat shocking, in a world that loves winners, to think that suffering is part of the possible experience of those of us who are faithful to God. And fourth, prophets have no authority except for the power of their words and their action. No one ever appoints a prophet to be prophets. There's no ordination process, no election, no such thing. They just start doing what is necessary and gather attention. They gather attention because of the weight of their words, the truth of them, the power of them, the capacity of those words to attract people's attention and captivate their moral imagination. So I had this imagination when I was preparing my notes today that our confirmands would actually be sitting out here right now, but they decided to go out with Pastor Renee. So what I have to say really going forward, I imagined I'd be saying to them, and I think I'll probably write a note to them and send it to them later. So you need to imagine that I'm talking to them and you guys just get to listen in to this part. A few weeks ago, Peter Sentner invited me to a policy committee meeting. The school board was taking up the transgender policy and needing to review that. And he invited me to be present, and I gladly went. And I want to note that Linda Morrison was also present for this conversation in some very helpful ways from her perspective as both a professional and as a parent. But here's what I really want us to pay attention to. The day I showed up, a number of students were there as well. They had taken time out of their very important classes in order to speak in their own voices around the policy in some very compelling ways about their perspective about what would be helpful to young people, to themselves, and to their peers. What would help youth feel safe, and what would enable them to learn. One of the people present was our own Matthew Avey, someone who last year, if you remember, at his own confirmation, read his own faith statement. And I went back and picked that faith statement out of our last year's recording. Here's a few things he said. We amplify God's love here on earth by following the teachings of Jesus, such as not to be judgmental because God is the one that judges. Through kindness, humans will thrive because that is what we are created to do. And he went on to affirm that even when the impact of our actions seems small, it is a step in the right direction and following what we have been taught. Now, if that's not connecting faith and his activity in this world, that's what we're called to do. And I thought about the fact that these young people who were at that policy meeting had no official authority. Nobody had ordained them to that job or given them power to do that. But still they stood there speaking truth to power. They used their imagination and used their faith to express what was important to them in that moment. Now, I have to say that it was the students being present there that day that inspired me 2 weeks ago to rearrange my own schedule. It was a little inconvenient, but I felt called to do so that I too could take a little action, could do a little advocacy. So I went to join others to do some lobbying at the Augusta State House for LGBTQ matters, since there is some legislation before the State House on matters around health care, institutional recognitions, and non-discrimination. If students can miss important classes, then I can do something that's inconvenient to me to be present to. So what does all this have to do with us? Well, I want to speak to our confirmands, and you all can listen in. First, the Bible teaches us that we do not have to have official positions of power to speak to power. Others will see and hear us, and others will join in eventually too. Second, listening to God is not just reading the Bible, though that helps. It's also being with others who value the Christian tradition and can help us to make sense of it and take it to heart and recognize what is holy and good in it. Third, the imagination is a holy tool. In fact, it is moral imagination that was behind the power of our biblical prophets, and it is moral imagination that is behind people such as Eboo Patel, who I mentioned earlier, or Greta Thunberg, or Naomi Wadler. Fourth, just as the Bible and adults around you will sometimes speak with one voice or with the voice of God, sometimes each one of us speaks with the voice of God. Not all the time. As a matter of fact, mostly we don't. But every now and then we get it right, and we speak with the voice of God. So when Jesus taught those ones on the road to Emmaus, opening up the scripture to them and talking about the prophets, Jesus was not just trying to point out who Jesus was. Jesus was also trying to point out who and what we can be. We are all called to a prophetic imagination in which we can do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.